Hello everyone. You can hear me okay, because I can hear myself coming back as well. Um, Firstly, just thanks to all of you for coming out today. I mean, I know it's a Friday afternoon, right? Heading into the weekend, and especially as it's so sunny for the first time in a few days. Um, so firstly, just thanks. I have to say that when Andy asked me if I would do this, typically I'm not terribly fond of standing in front of people in front of a mic and speaking, but when Andy asked me if I would, one, because I had heard so much about the book already, we'd been talking about it and while he was in the process of working on it, and I was excited just to read it. And two, just because, as many of you know, Andy has been such a tremendous support to so many of us over the course of his time here at Pratt, that there was no way I could say no. And now I'm glad I said yes, having read it, and I'm really eager to enter into a conversation with Andy. I have so many questions. First of all, just a little bit about Andy, or A.W. Barnes, as is on the book cover. He has a PhD in English literature and an MFA in creative writing. His nonfiction has appeared in Broad Street, Away Journal, Gertrude Press, and Sheepshead Review. His academic book, Post-Closet Masculinities in Early Modern England, was published by Bucknell University Press in 2009. I think many, if not all of you know, Andy as the wonderfully energetic Dean of the School of Liberal Arts and Sciences, a position that he's had for the past 8 years, during which, as I mentioned before, I've had the enormous pleasure of getting to know and work with him. Today, however, we're here to really for reading and a discussion of his new book, The Dark Eclipse, Reflections on Suicide and Absence. The Dark Eclipse is a book of personal essays in which Andy seeks to come to terms with the suicide of his older brother, Mike, using source documentation, the police report, autopsy, suicide note, and death certificate. The essays explore Andy's relationship with Mike and their status as gay brothers raised in a large conservative Midwestern family. While the other members of his family seem to have forgotten about Mike, who died in 1993, Andy has not been able to let him go, and this book is an attempt to do so. The Lambda Literary Review rightly calls The Dark Eclipse a lyric noir of family instability, personal revelation, and queer inheritance, both genealogical and literary, while Peter Trachtenberg, author of the Book of Calamities, proclaims it to be powerful, often devastating, and proof, if proof were needed, that personal essay can be at once immensely intelligent and profoundly moving. I couldn't agree more. So it's with great pleasure that I invite A.W. Barnes to read.
Thank you, Ellery. I appreciate it. Thank you guys for coming out. I appreciate it. This is the first time I'm reading in public. It's the first time I'm reading from this book, so I'm happy to be doing it here in front of y'all. I'm just going to read for about 15 minutes, just the first couple of pages of the book, and then I'll come over here and Ellery can ask all those questions he wants to ask me, which kind of frightens me a little bit. So I'm just going to start reading from the very beginning. The Midtown North Police Precinct in Manhattan is located at 306 West 54th Street between 8th and 9th Avenues. It's a 4-story limestone building in the Art Deco style of Rockefeller Center. The windows, however, look cheap. Thin metal frames and single-pane sashes, some of which are propped open with pieces of wood. In a few of the windows, there are air conditioners that drip water down the front of the building and stain the facade. An oversized American flag is supported by a sturdy-looking metal pole bolted to the front of the building. The flag hangs low over the sidewalk. The precinct has 2 doors, both metal and painted an algae green. The doors are set back in the portal with angular ornamentation along the lintel. Above the door on the right, in the silver plates, is the precinct's number, 18th. And above the door on the left, it reads, Office. Despite the obvious signage, I'm standing across the street trying to decide which door to enter. I've been standing here for over 15 minutes. It's my shrink's idea to come here. He thinks that I lack the desire or the initiative to look squarely at the facts of my past and to determine what is true and what has been distorted by time. A police cruiser rolls down the street and turns into the alleyway next to the building, driving down a ramp to the back of the building where, I imagine, people who have been arrested are brought into the precinct building. It's a damp day in early May of 2015. My skin feels clammy beneath my work shirt and wool pants. I don't know whether to unzip my coat to get some air beneath my clothes or button up the coat collar to keep the dampness out. A young man in a graying t-shirt and a patchy beard walks a bulldog down the block toward me. The dog zigzags from one side of the sidewalk to the other, sniffing the edges of stoops and around trees and at the bottom of trash bags piled up on the curb. The guy is talking on his cell phone and doesn't pay attention to either the dog or to me. When they reach me, I have to step off the curb and into the street between two black sedans in order to let them pass. I can't decide which door of the precinct to enter because I'm trying to recall a memory that has become cloudy over the years. I've been to this building before, 22 years ago, after my older brother Mike died. I was with my parents then, and we'd come to collect Mike's personal effects, his watch and eyeglasses and wallet and address book. We entered through one of these doors. It seems important to remember which one if I want the memory of that day to come back to me clearly. It was a Saturday in late October of 1993. Mike's body had been found in a hotel room in Times Square, which is part of the 18th precinct. I was living in Minneapolis and flew in that Friday, spending the night in Mike's apartment. My parents had flown in that morning from Indianapolis, the hometown where Mike and I grew up. My parents and I had met at the medical examiner's office to identify Mike's body, and then we headed across town to the 18th precinct building. It was mid-morning, and traffic coming up First Avenue was sparse. My mother and I crossed against the light. She wrapped herself around my arm. My father, however, refused to move and stood stoically on the sidewalk on the east side of the avenue. There are laws for a reason, my father said when the light changed and he caught up to us. My mother and I pretended as if we hadn't heard my father, like children ignoring an annoying sibling. I had a sense that my mother had spent most of her married life ignoring my father, who, before they married, was studying to be a Trappist monk. The vow of celibacy was obviously too much for him. He overreacted to this failure, I thought, by fathering 7 sons and 1 daughter, my older brothers Tony, Joe, and Mike, my younger brothers Eddie, Rob, and Pat, and my only sister Marie and me stuck in the middle. Marie was 23 months older than I was, 8 children born within the span of 11 years from 1957 to 1968, a time when strict Catholics like my parents believed that birth control was an affront to God and the church. My father may have left the monastery, I thought, but not monasticism. I've had to learn to put aside the lessons he tried to teach me, moral rectitude, a myopic worldview, and intolerance for difference. Before we went to the police station, we stopped for lunch at a restaurant patronized by tourists who liked fried mozzarella sticks and nachos and overdressed Caesar salads. It wasn't yet noon and the restaurant was empty. We sat in a plywood booth. It was dark. It was a dark and cavernous place that smelled of cigarette smoke and wet carpet. As she nearly always did back then, my mother wore a light blue windbreaker, which she took off and hung on a hook next to the booth. She also wore pleated khakis and a pale blue Gap sweater over a white polo shirt with a collar that had curled under. After hanging up her windbreaker, she scooted into the booth. My father wore almost the identical outfit, although his windbreaker was off-white and his Gap sweater was a pale yellow. He, too, hung up his jacket and then scooted in opposite my mother. I wore black jeans and a green t-shirt. I was muscular and proud of my body then. I was 29 years old. In the gay community, it was normal for us to wear jeans and t-shirts regardless of the occasion. A night out at the club, a Sunday morning brunch, a funeral. I sat in the booth next to my mother. "I tell you this much," my father said as we waited for someone to take our order. "I get his money." My father had a nose that looked permanently swollen, as if it had been broken a few times and never set properly. This caused him to speak from the back of his throat, so that at times it was difficult to understand what he was saying. My mother constantly called him out for muttering, which angered my father and caused him to shout at her. When he made a claim on Mike's money, I heard him clearly. I wanted to believe that my father's greed was a sign of his grief. I wanted to believe that losing a son had made him angry, and that his anger had made him unexpectedly small. I told myself that he was in shock and didn't know what he was saying, but still, my hands were shaking. I wanted to grab his shoulders and say that fathers aren't supposed to say these things about their dead sons. I kept silent for a while. What did he expect me to say anyway? Was he itching for a fight? For me to call him out on such an inappropriate comment? Did he expect me to take him to task the way Mike used to when we were younger? The waitress finally showed up to take our order. I blamed my father for Mike's death. I still do. Mike and I grew up as gay sons in a household where my father's unbearable ethics made it impossible for us to live there. In order to survive, Mike and I both abandoned Indianapolis. He moved to New York. I bounced from city to city until I too landed in New York a few years after Mike died. Although we no longer lived under my father's oppressive influence, the weight of our upbringing was difficult to carry. Even now, after Mike's been dead for a long time, and I have lived more years away from Indianapolis than I lived there, I feel a tightening in my chest when I think of my father. As we waited in the booth for our food, my mother leaned her body into mine. She'd spent most of my childhood doing this. It was obvious to her early on that my father and I would always be at odds. I was a sensitive boy who was nothing like him. My father was tough and dispassionate. My mother would periodically rub my back or run her fingers through my hair. We'd stand next to each other in the church pew, dutifully giving our liturgical responses, and she'd wrap her pinky around mine. I don't know if my mother ever did these things for Mike. I don't think she did. Mike was abrasive and offensive like the rest of my 5 brothers. But lately, I've come to think that Mike's aggressive nature was an act he adopted in order to protect himself. I couldn't bear sitting across from my father in the restaurant. I wanted to believe that when Mike died, he left me with a little bit of courage he had to stand up to my father. To tell my father, for example, that I've dreamt of being a writer since I was a boy. We didn't come from a family of writers, or one that appreciated writers, or any kind of artists. I was sure if I made this declaration to my father, he'd laugh at me. Perhaps we should give it to charity, I suggested about Mike's money. I sat on my hands to stop them from shaking, like God's love we deliver. Beneath the table, my mother placed her hand on top of my thigh. "What's that?" my father asked. He'd taken the salt and pepper shakers and placed them in front of him as if he were claiming ownership of them. "A charity," I repeated, "that helps people who are sick." "What kind of people?" I didn't answer him. God's Love We Deliver was a charity established to bring food to gay men who were shut in their apartments and dying of AIDS. My father believed that homosexuality was a choice, made by immoral people who had fallen so far from grace that they were a lost cause. My father believed this even of his own gay sons. "We could talk about it later," my mother said. My mother took her hand away and rearranged the silverware in front of her. My father pulled out a napkin from a metal dispenser on the table and laid it in his lap. A busboy came by and set glasses of ice water in front of each of us. I took a gulp of water from mine. "I'm determined to live my own life," I said suddenly. "I don't feel as if I owe it to anyone to live in a certain way." "That's right, darling," my mother said, rubbing my back. "You owe something to me," my father said. I wasn't looking at my father, but instead across the empty restaurant. If I looked at him, I was sure that I'd lose my nerve. "That's not how I see it," I said. "Well, you see a lot of things wrong," my father told me. "I'm my own person," I insisted, looking down at my silverware. "You are indeed," my mother said. She folded her hands in her lap and looked at my father as if she were trying to prevent him from doing anything rash. "The problem with this country," my father said, "is that people have forgotten that a debt has always got to be repaid." My father came from a long line of hard-working men, of railroad workers and boilermakers who had in turn descended from Scottish laborers. He grew up in Indianapolis with no money and little hope of escaping the blue-collar lives of his father and grandfather. But he had been tough and self-reliant, going to college on an athletic scholarship and, after serving in the Korean War, finding a job as a gym teacher. He raised a family of 8 children on a gym teacher's salary and an ethics of self-sufficiency. He was a Reagan Republican through and through. My father was a man who pulled himself up by his own bootstraps and had little pity for anyone who couldn't do the same. "That's enough, Frank," my mother said. "It's not right," my father said. "It's simply not right." The waitress returned with our order. We ate as if we were starving. Given our history and the improbability of changing my relationship with my father, when Mike died, I thought I'd have a chance to fix things with my father. Couldn't Mike's death be the necessary jolt that closed the chasm between us? Couldn't my father and I put aside what religious or political convictions we held in order to accept one another as we were? At the very least, I wanted my father to give up his belief that being gay was a death sentence. When he was finished eating, my father pushed his plate away. It bumped into my mother's, and she looked at him as if she'd kicked him under the table. My father looked around for the waitress. He saw the busboy and tried to get his attention by snapping his fingers. The busboy ignored him. My father took a sip of his water and tightened his face as if the water were stale. "It's not your fault," I said under my breath, hoping that only my mother would hear me. "Damn right it's not," my father said, thinking that I was speaking to him. Unlike my father, my mother blamed herself for Mike's death. She had told me this when I spoke with her on the phone before my parents flew to New York. My mother looked at me now. Her eyes watered. If we were alone, I thought she'd ask me how I could be certain that Mike's death wasn't her fault. She'd ask me to help her understand what had happened. She'd ask for forgiveness. I would hold her hand and say that it was going to be all right, that grief was bound to subside and leave behind just a trace of what she was feeling at that moment. I hoped that this would also be true for me. "Excuse me," my father yelled across the restaurant. The busboy looked at my father but didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took a large glass of something from the waiter's stand and took a long drink before heading over to our table. "Can you tell our waitress to bring our check?" my father said when he arrived. The busboy gathered up our empty plates in silence and retreated into the kitchen. My father pulled out his wallet and placed it squarely on the table in front of him. Before the bill arrived, I stood up and allowed my mother to slip out of the booth. She took her jacket from the hook and put it on. "We'll be outside," she said to my father. I followed her out of the restaurant. "He doesn't mean it," my mother said as we stood on the sidewalk. She took out a balled-up Kleenex from her jacket pocket and wiped her nose. He's just angry. My mother was tougher than I ever gave her credit for being. If my father is to be lauded for having raised 8 children on a gym teacher's salary, my mother was the one who bore us one after the other with barely a respite, seeming always to have been pregnant, as every photo of our childhoods attests. She was the one at home feeding us, changing our diapers, bathing us, washing our clothes, comforting us when we were ill or grieved, scolding us when we misbehaved. She took the brunt of the force that 8 children packed so closely together in age inevitably brings. We should talk about this, I said, reaching up and rubbing her shoulders as if I were suddenly the caregiver in our relationship. We will, she said. She placed her palms flat on my chest and I lowered my arms, but not now. My father came out of the restaurant struggling to get his jacket on. He had his right arm in the jacket's sleeve, but couldn't get his hand back far enough to get the left arm in. My mother helped him. I hailed a cab. Thank you.